The question is, why hasn't a change in understanding and how learning works not caused equivalent changes in how we study and how we teach? This is a complicated question with more than one reasonable answer. I'm going to break my answer up into two parts. First, there is the question of why good ideas, that is, ideas that have a lot of support in the research literature, why these ideas have not made their way into general public awareness. And the second part is why bad ideas, that is, ideas that have pretty much no research support whatsoever, why these ideas have historically made their way into wide public awareness. The reason the second question matters is that when you start off with misconceptions about something, when someone tries to correct those misconceptions, it's really hard to change your whole way of thinking about something. So the bad ideas, in a way, act to block the good ideas from coming in. Let's begin with a thought experiment. Say that you think that doing 10 jumping jacks before every class would help students to learn. Now, at this point, that's just an idea. There's no research to support this idea whatsoever. It's just an idea. So the next thing that we might think about doing is actually trying to test this idea. Let's say we all huddle around, we figure out how to test it, and then we go and test and we find out that, hey, jumping jacks do really seem to help. Students who do jumping jacks before class, they end up with better learning outcomes, they end up with better test scores, all this good stuff. Now, at this point, two things are probably going to happen. One is, as we are building up the case for jumping jacks, as we're doing the research, we start to convince ourselves, we start to believe that jumping jacks really does help. And at some point, we have to start putting that knowledge into practice. If it just sits there and no one ever changes what they're doing, well, what was the point of doing the research in the first place? People start doing jumping jacks at schools. We start recommending that and advising that people do jumping jacks at schools, and we should see a change in how students and teachers end up teaching. Now, there is a very important point that I'm skipping over here, which is we would also want an understanding of how jumping jacks are helping kids, and we would probably also want to test how jumping jacks are actually benefiting learning outcomes. But we're going to skip over that question for the sake of this video. And I really just want to focus on this idea of testing. Because the problem is a lot of popular ideas about learning and education just avoid the testing part altogether. This seems to be what happened with Dale's cone of experience. Now, maybe you've seen this before. This is a cone of learning, cone of experience that describes how much people learn under these different modes. So you're supposed to learn like 30% of what you see and 20% of what you hear, or something like this. Now, the original source of this idea came from someone just observing that there are different kinds of activities that students can do. You can watch a demonstration, you can hear them describe something, you can actively participate in building something, right? There are just different kinds of activities that people can do. It was not linked to learning outcomes at all. Then later, somehow, somebody decided, hey, each of these activities is actually connected to a specific learning outcome or percentage amount learned, let's say. And conveniently, they did so in 10% increments, or in 5% increments, or in 15% increments. None of these charts mean anything. There were no experiments, there were no tests, there was no research of any kind. This idea just passed into public consciousness as if it was scientific knowledge, when it pretty flatly contradicts everything we know about learning. Okay, another example of the same faulty idea is the idea of learning styles. Learning styles is the idea that some people learn better visually, other people learn better auditorily, and there are other kinds of modes of learning that we can talk about. Learning better here means that you have higher learning outcomes if you are matched with your specific learning style. So if you are a visual learner, the idea is that you would learn anything better if it was presented to you visually. Now, this started as a proposed explanation for why some students do well in one class and other students do not. But before anyone tested or critically examined this idea, it became conventional wisdom. It was taught to teachers, it was taught to students. Companies started designing diagnostic tests to identify students' learning style. All of the meaningful tests of the idea of learning styles actually happened after it was already widely implemented and understood to be true. And these tests all showed that there's no merit to this idea. Not only does it not make sense from a logical perspective, but there's just no empirical data backing this up even a little bit. The problem is, just like I was saying earlier, that once an idea is lodged into people's brains and into the institutional structures, it's very, very hard to get rid of. So looking at these two examples, you can see that one of the main problems is meaningful tests done at the right time. A second dysfunctional path that's related to the idea of testing involves business. Suppose we have an idea, and suppose we have a product. And to sell our product, we need to get people to believe our idea. Now, there's not any research or testing on this idea, of course. We are just going to make blanket statements that seem true to people in order to convince people to buy our products. My favorite example of this is the Baby Einstein series of TV programs aimed at young children. The product was the video programs they want people to buy. And the idea was that if you expose very young children to some of the great important ideas, scientific ideas, classical music, poetry, great literature, if you expose very young kids to these things, then you end up with smarter kids. No one ever tested this idea. It turned out to have the opposite effect. The more time that children spent watching Baby Einstein videos, the lower their vocabulary. There are some pretty good reasons why Baby Einstein videos don't work. We have a much better understanding of how screen time affects children, and the upshot is that time spent watching TV basically takes away time from other really important activities for child development. One of these activities is interaction with a parent or another human being. And the other is physical activity. Interaction with an adult ends up building vocabulary a lot more than, say, just passively watching a television program. And physical activity is generally good for cognitive development and overall health. So whatever value that these TV programs brought couldn't really make up for the losses that were occurring in these other areas. But let's say you're a more sophisticated business. You don't want to look like there's absolutely no research to back things up. You want to say things like it's research-backed, it's evidence-based, it's scientifically proven. You do have a kind of test for the ideas that are going to help sell your product. The problem is, it's not a very good test. Brain training is one of the best examples of this. So brain training advocates can point to single papers in the scientific literature that do suggest that some specific forms of brain training do have some potential benefits to working memory and other areas of the brain. The problem is that those specific studies are not representative of the body of research as a whole in this area, and the more rigorous that your research study is, the less likely it is to find any kind of effects of brain training. The findings from these specific studies just fall apart under scrutiny and under kind of the body of ever more evidence suggesting that brain training is just not a thing. This gives brain training companies enough cover to say, well, it's based on scientific principles, even though it's actually not really supported by science at all. Another example is Supermemo, which is the original spaced repetition flashcard app. Now, when I first read about Supermemo, which was years ago now, I was super impressed and I thought, oh, okay, there's a formula for effective learning and they've cracked it. All I have to do is to use this app and suddenly I'm going to be a very effective learner. Even up until a few years ago, I thought that the graduated spacing technique that they advocated for was generally agreed upon to be optimal. But the more that I read about spaced practice and spaced learning and all this stuff, the less sure I became of that. There is agreement that spacing is good. So there is some research to support Supermemo's general claims, but the creator of the program seems fixated on research he did 30 years ago and is basically just ignoring the past 30 years of research on learning, even though our understanding of how learning works has changed pretty dramatically in the meantime. Weak tests don't just come from businesses. They come from academia as well. There is research that's just based on faulty assumptions. There's research that compares two groups that really shouldn't be compared. There's research that doesn't measure learning outcomes very well. Whether you're a company or an academic, it just takes time and effort, and it takes a lot of arguing and figuring things out to understand what a good test is of an idea. But if we are still at the stage where people are arguing about what a good test of an idea is, we probably shouldn't be recommending the idea to students or teachers or parents. But these examples of bad ideas making their way into educational practice is really just one half of the story. Why don't the rigorously tested ideas make their way into educational practice? You might think that the people who study learning and teaching talk pretty regularly to the people who spend their professional lives teaching students. Historically, that has not been the case. There hasn't been a lot of communication between researchers and teachers. Researchers were off doing their thing, answering questions that they themselves were bringing up and talking to each other, and teachers were over here doing their thing, teaching people and trying to figure out like what best teaching practices are there and trying to build on their experiences. And there wasn't any crosstalk between the two. This led researchers to do a lot of research that was kind of irrelevant or uninteresting to the teachers who are doing the actual teaching, and it led teachers to not really getting access to the important findings that could influence or improve their own teaching practice. Now, you might think that teacher training programs would inform teachers about all of the latest research. Seems like that would be their role, right? But that's not the case. A 2016 review of the leading teacher training textbooks found basically no scientifically based principles in those textbooks, and in some cases found some of these learning myths that we've already talked about being passed off as facts. So yeah, there's that. But even when there is flow of communication and information between these two groups, it's still hard. Ideas and words and the language that people use, as they are passed along from community to community, they tend to start meaning different things. There are also questions of implementation. There's a lot of research on learning. How do you put it all together to make an effective teaching or studying practice? Now, it doesn't help, of course, that people begin with misconceptions about learning. So then when you start to tell them, say something like learning styles aren't real, in their head, they think that what you're saying is, well, everybody just learns the same and there's no differentiation whatsoever, which doesn't seem true to them at all. All of these things just make it hard for good ideas to pass into actual practice. The good news is that things are changing. There are more learning researchers who are writing books for the general public, for instance, and some of those are really good books. I've got a couple of those in the description below. There's much better teacher training programs and professional development programs out there that take the research on learning seriously and that are led by knowledgeable, experienced teachers. And finally, there are more bona fide collaborations between teachers and researchers, which help people to address meaningful research questions and figure out some of these tricky implementation issues and just lead to overall better, productive communication between these two groups. But we have a long way to go, I think, before we start using our growing knowledge base effectively. Do you have a story about the translation of research into practice going right, or more than likely going wrong? I would love, love, love to hear it. If you can write about it in the comments or send me a link to maybe a research paper or something like that. I'm collecting a bunch of these stories and I plan on sending out one of these stories a week in an email list that you can sign up for down below. Okay, that's it. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.